Hello, folks. Welcome to Sweetspot Safari. Conversations about patterns and polarities within us, between us, and all around us. The purpose of these discussions is to explore how we can navigate opposing different viewpoints with a sense of balance and nuance. I'm Ben. This is John. We're your hosts and Sweetspot hunters. Today, we're joined by Marcus Harris to explore the pattern Centre and the Fringe. Marcus, we've known each other for some time now. We both grew up in Ipswich. Delighted to have you here. We share a love of music. We hadn't seen each other for quite a few years, and recently we've reconnected, which has been great. And yeah, really appreciate you joining us today. How about a quick introduction? A little bit about you personally and professionally.
Sure. Thanks for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here. So, as you said, I grew up in Ipswich, and we bonded over a shared love of music. Ipswich is the type of place where you have to make your own entertainment. So, as a result of that, I got involved in the local cultural scene, music production, DJing, putting on parties, putting on events, and that led to work with a CSV, a charity, who had a media centre in the town that I worked at, as well as a radio station. And as the years went on, I became more aware of lots of different facets of the creative industries, from sort of print media, filmmaking. I went on to study filmmaking and sound engineering at university, and have always kept my oar in, so to speak, in that type of work. But my interest in wanting to do good in the world or in society as such led me to work within charity. So I stayed at CSV for a few years. Then I went off to London to work on a large-scale regeneration program in Fulham. That was the New Deal for Communities program, and I did some consultancy after that. This then led to some more film projects, and then I moved to Spain with my wife shortly after getting married. We wanted a bit of an adventure for ourselves before children came along. So we went to Spain, thinking it was going to be maybe for 3 years, and almost 10 years later, and 2 children, we decided to come back to the UK, as I found a job in London working on the Creative Enterprise Zone initiative in Croydon for the Mayor's Office, the GLA. And that's been a really exciting and interesting journey over the last 3 years. Where I've been involved in successfully bidding for Croydon to become the London Borough of Culture. I've helped develop a cluster within the creative industry sector, and helped develop those relationships between business in the sector, the wider cultural scene, and the local authority. And I'm promoting them around the world, doing various bits of work with these organisations. And it's ultimately led me back to Ipswich as a result of the pandemic, just outside Ipswich, where I'm here hoping to be able to apply some of the lessons I've learned and some of the knowledge I've gained to the situation in our town at the moment, trying to bring it back home. So
yeah. Well, that's I guess just listening to all that, it's pretty varied. You've kind of been exploring, and it's interesting, isn't it, how many roads lead back to Ipswich?
True. I mean, ultimately, I've just followed my nose over the years. I've only got 2 real criteria for anything I get involved in. I need to be interested in it, and I need to be able to learn something from it. And ultimately, if there's a third criteria, it's got to be able to pay the bills. And that's really it. So that's led me on a route that's enabled me to indulge my interests a lot of the time as well. So it's been great,
I do think they're probably very good principles. If any young people are watching, looking to think about how to think about making career choices, actually there's a few useful principles there. So so coming back to the conversation today and the idea about sweet spots, you want to talk today about the relationship between the fringe and the centre, which we both think was really interesting. So why have you chosen this pattern?
Well, primarily due to my interest in arts and creativity, you tend to find, or in my personal experience, I've found that the most interesting things are often happening out on the fringe. And as time goes on, some of these interesting things work their way to the centre. And on that journey to the centre, they become more commercial, or they become more accepted in the mainstream. And in some cases, in the case of some forms of music, for example, they lose something. In some cases, in the forms of certain films, they gain something. Something can come to a wider audience, or something that may have only been seen by a few people is managed to be enjoyed or appreciated by a larger number of people. It also ties into my interest in sort of politics and society at large, where I'm always horizon scanning for what are the fringe ideas, what are the fringe thinking, what fringe thinking is happening at any particular time. So I've managed to, catch a lot of things that have, found their way to the mainstream, found their way to the center in recent years, such as the whole QAnon phenomenon in the States. I was reading about that on 4chan like many years ago, the kind of seeds of that. And obviously fringe figures people who were fringe figures such as your Alex Joneses, I remember he was doing what he was doing back in the late 90s, again a very fringe figure who is now entered the discourse and has gone on quite a journey, and he's now somebody who's known around the world, albeit for some questionable activities. But it's fascinating, and it's something that can be applied to many aspects of life.
Okay. Oh, that's great, Marcus. That's brilliant context as well. And it feels sort of highly nuanced. So if I can indulge you in a more philosophical question, how would you, in the context that you described, identify the differences between, say, the centre and the fringe, and what the key attributes of those are?
I mean, in terms of the creative filter, if I'm looking at it through that lens, if it's something that's on the fringe, you're not going to see it happening in many places, or it might only be happening in one or two places somewhere, or it might not be happening in any geographic location. It might be something that solely exists on the internet, for example. Whereas if something is in the center, when I say center, I mean very much the mainstream. I mean very much available for the man or woman in the street to be able to access easily. When things happen to be on the fringe, you might have to sniff them out a bit more. You're going to have to do a little bit of digging to find out about them, and you may have to, find your way in through a contact or through some form of initiation in some way, shape, or form. Whereas when things are in the center, you can go and buy them in the supermarket. Let's just say, you can find them on your Netflix menu or whatever the case may be. So there's, as in my view, as things move towards the center, access becomes easier. That tends to be the key factor that I've noticed in my journey, at least, anyway.
Yeah, but not necessarily bland just because it's in the center.
Oh, not necessarily bland at all. No, it's like, in some cases it can boost things up. So, for example, in the case of some of the film work I've been involved in or I've been privy to, as things go towards the center, more money is attached to them, and those projects can balloon and get a lot bigger, and again can be enjoyed by a mainstream audience and can potentially fulfill whatever vision they have because they've got that additional resource.
Yeah, it makes me think about going back to our music connection, and we both ran nights, and I remember quite fondly just having maybe 3 or 4 avid people that used to come to every night, but they kind of really like the music, irrespective of whether there's loads of people there. And in my music, Berlin or kind of Detroit techno, not massive in Ipswich, and it was interesting then moving from Ipswich to London and how increasingly over time it just seemed to be on every street corner. And I fell out of love with it when it was just basically all around me. I really liked the sense of chase, of going somewhere a little bit secret, a little bit offbeat, where it's actually a little bit more difficult to find. And when it was just there, all in front of you, it lost some of its charm, lost some of its magic.
I can relate to that. It's definitely, and that's what I'm alluding to when I say that there's a sense of initiation into something, into whether it's a musical form or whether it's a group of people or if it's a type of activity that's going on, where you have to cross certain thresholds or boundaries to access it. So, for example, growing up in the era that we did, we were buying records on vinyl, and you had to go to the record shops. You had to build your relationships with the counter staff to the point where they would then give you the exclusive releases or the stuff that was under the counter that was not available to everybody. It's that sense of initiation, and I think that's something that potentially, as we move into sort of the full-on digital age, is lost in some cases. But it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's just something that perhaps doesn't exist anymore. In some respects, it's great that certain things have been democratized, but again, I personally miss that sense of having to sniff things out and having to kind of be initiated into things at times.
Yeah. I don't know. I think the initiation piece, and we've talked about rites of passage, and there is something important there. I wonder about the internet, and obviously technology changes, these patterns and these polarities. They can amplify or negate. But I just wonder what your thoughts are on how the internet has shaped the dynamic between fringe ideas, or the fringe and central. I don't. There's kind of like decentralization versus centralization function. Something. Two different things going on the internet. What are your thoughts there?
That's interesting. I mean, decentralization seems to be operating hand in hand with this kind of new age of transparency we find ourselves in. But in terms of the internet, again, in some senses, it's the infinite fringe. Because it's got so many sort of dark corners, or so many corners where things can be found, or communities can operate in the shadows, or can operate just unmolested, doing whatever it is that they do. But again, in the fringes of the internet, you do get some interesting things looking at it through the creative lens. For example, you have the music genre of vaporwave, for example, that only existed on the internet. It was really one of the first genres of music that did not come from a geographic location. It came from the internet. It came from that kind of flattening of time that we've had on the internet, whereby everything there ever was is now available forever. So if you want, it was an exploration for those who are not familiar with the genre. It's a kind of reimagining of what the 1980s was like, by young people who were never there, through sampling or taking sections of old soul and boogie and soft rock records of the 80s and the synth pop records, slowing them down and sort of putting effects on it and making them sound very spaced out, alongside sort of animations of like Roman busts or early 90s sort of virtual reality style graphics. So it's a reimagining of a past time, because now time itself has flattened, so all that music is available again for them, and it can be repurposed in some way, shape or form. And this existed in its own right, since the late 00s, and then slowly through the 2010s came to the mainstream, or came to be known, and now you're hearing elements of it within pop music.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because and not being that type of music aficionado, I mean, I'm very much enjoy my music. It feels as though that the pendulum keeps swinging all the time, right? From the center to the fringe and then back again. And I know it was interesting because I'm a big old rock fan. I saw Robert Plant last year. I saw the Rolling Stones and stuff, and still absolutely love it. And I've been realizing recently that a lot of my daughter's generation, which is late teens, early 20s, have been going back to the sort of 60s and 70s rock and buying vinyl and stuff. And we were, funnily enough, listening to her Apple play in the car on the way home from Cambridge today. And she said, "Oh, you really like this? It's a Greta Van Fleet." And he said that apparently Robert Plant says it's very like what he used to do and stuff. So it feels as though things are reinventing themselves. So I was quite interested to hear what you're saying about the reimagining term that they use there, Marcus.
It's something that absolutely fascinates me, because it's like I say, time with the internet and the state of the sort of the digital world, time has absolutely flattened. So as a young person, there was a wish list of old music that I always wanted for sampling, old reggae records or old dub records or old soul records, that I always wanted to purchase, but you never could, because they were either too expensive or too hard to find, or you had to go somewhere to get them, or know the right record dealers. But now you have Discogs, which has flattened it out, and the music is all there available. And in the more mainstream kind of sense, you have something like a Spotify, where if you are a young person growing up, like your daughter, if there's a band you like, you can access their full back catalogue immediately, and you can spend weeks or months listening to that and reappreciating what you've heard, and then reimagining it if you were going to make it now. I also worked in music production and have done for many years, and there's a lot of that goes on. If I was living in that time period, this is how I would make that type of sound or that type of music, and I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I think it's one of the key things in the digital world that has only just become possible. Ultimately, in music, in film, you're seeing it with the way that people can now make a film and grade it as if it was made in the early 70s, for example. So it looks and feels like that. The last Quentin Tarantino film would be a great example of that. But this is what I think the key benefit of the digital world is.
So just following that thread briefly, because it's just passed through my head, is I saw a quote recently. I think it was, I don't know whether it's Steven Spielberg, but certainly Quentin Tarantino has basically criticized the Marvel brand for repetition and it being a bit bland and nebulous, and it's not really films and stuff. So I guess it's a broader question: is there a danger with this sort of flattening of time and leveling, which everyone, that we could end up with stuff that is less fringe worthy, sorry, horrible word, you know, and more bland and center focused, you know?
Absolutely. Marvel Comics is the perfect example of when I say that, when I describe that journey from the fringe to the center. You know, these are comics made for teenage boys in like the 1960s onwards, that have slowly worked their way through popular culture all the way through to the center, and to the point where now they're these multi-million-dollar spectacles that have, on their journey to the center, have lost something because they're so fine-tuned and so kind of calculated to be that roller coaster ride, to be that kind of Disneyland experience when you go to see these films, that they have become ultimately formulaic. You know, to the point where the formula works. You have a bunch of investors who are the producers, obviously, who want a return on their investment, and they know they're going to get a particular return on their investment if a certain formula is followed. But there is hope. As you say, the pendulum swings, and just as we've reached this point with Marvel Comics, I think that same point was reached with Westerns, you know, in the possibly in the 70s. And then they went away and reinvented themselves and came back, and we had some very interesting films. And I feel that superhero films will do that again. I think we're past peak superheroes, so to speak. But this is the Marvel brand is a very good example of what happens when, yeah, something on its way to the center is the dead horse is flogged so much, because there's always going to be a market for it. There's always going to be new young people coming up who want to see this stuff. But ultimately, people will get fed up with it, and taste will move on, and the pendulum will swing away. At least that's what my prediction is for that.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to work out, what is it? So if you think of your vision, you've almost got your focal point, your central, sure, central focus, and you've got your peripheral vision. So you know, in a similar way, you know, this round the edge is quite fuzzy. What happens when we shine a spotlight and focus on that peripheral fringe bit? Why can that be detrimental to music, to you know, cultural and creative activities? What is it about that shining the spotlight on the fringe which maybe causes issues?
Well, it's not. I don't know if it causes issues as such. It's when it travels to the center is where the issues occur. As something has to become a commodity, you know, as it has to provide a return on the investment. The wonderful thing about things that happen in the fringe, particularly in the arts, is that people are not doing it to make money. They're doing it because they want to experience something. They're doing it because they want this. They want something to exist in the world. You know, they're doing it because of the love of just doing it. You know, and increasingly, as we've gone into a world where, for example, people involved in independent music are finding it harder and harder to make a real income from it. You know, you do end up having to do it because you just love the process of doing it. You know, and that could be said for the wider creative industries as well. You know, but as things have to become commodified as they go to the center, they have to be more fine-tuned. They have to be presented for sale, so to speak. You know, and it seems that there's ever only sort of limited room for certain things to make it into the center. And it is the key challenge, I think, for creatives, is how do you bring your idea or your product or whatever it is you're doing out in the fringe to the center without sacrificing something or without diluting it? Because a lot of the time, certain things need dilution to achieve a mass audience, you know, or to achieve mass adoption. In some cases, if we're looking at it through the lens of sort of politics, then in that case, when things travel from the fringe to the center, they gain momentum and take on their own life, so to speak. You know, if we're talking about things like conspiracy theories.
Yeah. And so just connecting back to the political side, is there any connection here between different impulses, one for you know, tradition and structure, and another one towards like progress and change? You know, is the kind of central and fringe framing, does that map onto those impulses, do you think?
I guess potentially in a way, because there are those people who feel that tradition and culture has been lost somehow, or a sense of something, whether that's the sense of being British, and they've incorporated fringe ideas in an attempt to bring them back to the centre. You know, the likes of your UKIPs or your Britain First. You know, people want to take back control and go back to some halcyon days that perhaps didn't exist, you know, whereas there are people operating, you know, for example, on the left, out in the fringes, looking at new ways of living, new ways of, acting within society. You know, if you look at in Spain, there are a number of places that I was aware of where they had towns where they didn't use money at all. You know, where everybody was sort of bartering, or that they were following an absolutely different way of living. You know, and those things have stayed very much on the fringe, you know, even though some of those ideas, you know, in recent years have started to enter the discourse, as I think in general people are realizing perhaps the way capitalism has been working over the last 40 years hasn't worked for everybody, and it's time to explore some different ideas. You know, that's partly why I imagine people are out on the streets just today, you know, and yesterday. Yeah. Striking.
So that's really interesting. I'd like to, and this is sort of slightly tangential, partly cultural, partly political. Not. It's funny. I was talking to somebody today about a business model around associate models, right, where people are not actually employed. You know, it's the gig economy. We have a series of associates, sure. And it was interesting. What struck me is when you said things when they move to the centre are getting commoditized, and we know with experience that as things get commoditized, margins go down. And people's propensity to earn, creative people, you know, not just in the arts, but even in engineering and science, sure. get reduced dramatically. So, and it was interesting, the lady was saying that, oh, that's why a lot of the youth are moving, not just the gig economy, but they're also collaborating a lot more, because what they're doing is not just doing their particular niche. They're trying to do multiple niches by collaborating with other people. In order to have, you know, the third leg of the stool, in order to earn enough money to live and enjoy life and everything else. So I'm just wondering whether there's an opportunity there as a sweet spot for collaboration, and people start doing, you know, different things, and that's not necessarily their core niche, but maybe a series of niches, or finding new connections to create new niches, if that makes sense. Mark.
Oh, absolutely. That's something I'd absolutely agree with. It's almost like you know, having a number of a young person coming up today having a number of strings to their bow and being able to collaborate on a project by project basis as almost like a guild. You know, where you have a group of people who have a different range of activities, who can take on a project, whatever that project may be, and then share in the spoils of said project. You know, I think it's again, this is something that's emerging in the 21st century as a viable way to work. I've always seen myself, you know, on paper, I'm technically a project manager or a program manager on paper, and that's how I approach everything I do. My life is a series of projects. You know, I'll finish one, even if it's a job that I'm employed in, so to speak. I see it as a project. There's some very clear objectives that I'd like to reach, and there's a beginning, a middle, and end to it. And in order to reach those objectives, very often I do have to team up with people to get the best out of the work that I can do. So I think it's a very, very viable approach nowadays. And I think it's something increasingly, as you know, we're caught up in the gig economy and the increasing sort of compartmentalization of tasks or jobs, you know, to those constituent parts or to specific niches. I think it's an approach that's definitely worth taking, you know.
Yeah, and I've just as you were talking earlier on, it came to me, you know, the kind of focus on diversity and inclusion. If we were to say, you know, diversity and inclusion, you know, done well, done holistically, done, you know, for, you know, its right purpose, is it a case that that's a kind of almost an oscillation between differentiation and bringing in people and ideas and from the margins and integrating them into the center. So is that fair?
100%, yeah. Because this, you know, there are people operating within society whose stories have not been heard, whose opinions have not necessarily mattered, and that's diversity in the broadest term of the words. You know, in terms of those people who technically have never had a voice, and through the internet or through the technology or through the way we're living today are increasingly becoming vocal about that as a means to be able to have a voice. I think that's where the new ideas that are going to come from. You know, we're seeing it. We're in the I think we're still in the birthing pains of this type of approach to things, because you have a core of people, a central core of people within the establishment who are perhaps not fully receptive to this. But as time goes on, the challenges we all face as a society will need to be addressed by good ideas, and those good ideas can be found wherever you can find them. And increasingly, people are looking out to the fringe, in terms of markets to exploit. It's the fringe markets it's only the fringe markets that are now left, for example. This is why, in my view at least, you're seeing the exploration around the decriminalization of drugs in certain places, or cannabis would be the example du jour, let's just say, whereby it's been illegal for many years, but people are realizing, and there's proof of concept of how a fringe activity such as the growing of this material can generate funds that increase the tax base, as it has done in certain parts of America. So people are watching very carefully. Also, the same could be said for things like universal basic income, which was initially a very fringe idea, but is now right in the heart of things, where you've got people like Sam Altman of OpenAI, running the largest experiment in UBI to see if it is something that's feasible to bring into the mainstream, to find purpose for people who have become displaced by the digital world.
That's really interesting.
You go, John.
Yeah, sure. I was going on to, when Ben was talking with yourself about bringing people back together, people who've been on the fringes and the margins, it's almost though they are being franchised again, effectively given an opportunity. And one thing that Ben knows that sort of I'm quite interesting is this disenfranchising due to technology, right? For either people who don't have access to the resources to technology, so they become disenfranchised, because these days we are totally reliant. There's certain countries in the world. I've worked recently in the Middle East, and you cannot go anywhere without a mobile phone. Without a mobile phone, you cannot function. Whether it be medical, COVID, you name it, whatever. And then, of course, there's the whole age thing as well, where there are people above a certain age, mid to late 70s, who just cannot function without using checks, for instance. And I saw a horrible situation in a bank with a very old guy the other week, whereby the poor guy was totally, bemused and dazed, because every time he thought he'd solved the problem, they faced off with him some more technology, which he didn't get. And so I know that's probably an extreme example. So I just to see where this whole concept of reenfranchising people is positive, but there's also opportunity to disenfranchise people. And then, as a coach, I'm thinking people need to be self-aware, right? There's the my brother's keeper element of this. It's not just about me, it's think about the other people who are on the fringes or weren't on the fringes and now moved to the fringes. Does that make sense, Marcus?
Absolutely. Again, it's something that I'm very interested in. The digital divide, and how, as you say, on one hand, technology gives, but also it brings people together, but it's also pushing many people out. Whether that's linked to economics or linked to age, as in the example that you gave. But I think there is, again, that sense of collective ideas coming in from the fringe to help support those people who are going to have problems in this day and age, and I think, going back to the centre and fringe polarity, where we've had a society in the UK, at least, has been run very centrally. I think we're going to see it come out to the fringes, to our own local areas and our own local communities, because that's really the scale where people can make a difference. And I think that's where we can address some of those problems that you're talking about. I think they will be addressed on a local level. So I'll be going to check on my neighbour if they need anything doing that involves tech, and they're elderly. They know they can knock on my door in the village, and I'll be there to help them. I don't think the answers to some of those challenges are going to come from anywhere central, unfortunately.
And that's the process of devolution, I guess you're referring to.
Yeah.
And to play that out further, so I guess, do you see that there's different points in the devolution journey?
Well, it's been something that's been on the agenda for many years, and successive governments have talked about it, and I think it's something that many people would like to see. I was reading just today that there are those in the north of England who feel that if they were their own autonomous entity, they would have a fairer crack of the whip. And I think for some political stripes, they would potentially like that, where they could dole out a proportion of funding to each part of the country and say, right, you're on your own now. You can do what you can with that, But I think it's coming potentially. We'll see what it looks like. I mean, it's happening in different levels now. As you find more regions being created or more kind of local areas having to link up with their neighbouring areas, such as the health services that we've seen in recent years and the police, for example. But ultimately, I think for solving some of these social challenges that we've touched on, I definitely think the answers will come from a local basis. I don't think it will be not even regional. I think it will be much more local than that. You're going to be helping people in your town, within your community, within the world that you can affect within your own circle of influence.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's a matter of time. How fast, how soon will that happen? And at the same time, that might coincide with universal basic income. Universal in the name, something for everyone. So that kind of feels very central and core, which allows the kind of local exploration and decision making at the same time. And that kind of universal basic income idea was a Fringe idea not so long ago, and I think back to some of the ideas which we've experienced during COVID. The idea of locking down a whole country, was a let's say it's a pretty crazy idea. 4 years ago, and then suddenly that became very normalized, standardized and accepted. And it kind of makes me think about the Overton window. I don't know if you think that, for our listeners, whether that's a useful tool or concept for understanding how Fringe ideas become mainstream.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. In terms of politics, or in terms of what becomes acceptable, the Overton window in itself, the frame through which particularly dialogue on the right is shifting in terms of what is acceptable in the public discourse. I just recently have been shocked to see some of the rhetoric that's come out of our government recently. So I'm watching press conferences where it says "stop the boats." I'm seeing politicians reel back on promises that were made where citizens of this country had been deported, because they didn't have paperwork in place after being invited to come to Britain as a citizen of the empire 50 or 60 years ago. These are things that I never thought I would see. But they're happening now because this type of discourse over the last 10, 15 years has become more acceptable in the mainstream, because you've had airtime given to figures who potentially should have remained on the fringe. I'm speaking of the likes of your Nigel Farages, for example, where certain extreme ideas have, or ideas that were once thought of extreme, had been adopted by mainstream politicians as a means to potentially either keep voters or keep people on side or ensure they remain in power. And it's a scary thing, I think, and it's playing out in real time in front of us right now.
So it's really interesting, going back, it's sort of partly culture, partly politics, but going back to your idea of devolution and ecosystems, I mean, that's what we're talking about, is ultimately self-sustaining ecosystems, which will, depend on sort of bartering, methods of production, local energy generation, and all the sort of things that we've been talking about. But it's quite interesting. I read an interesting book a few years ago by a Korean author who was a Cambridge academic, called 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. And it was quite interesting because you look at that title and you think, oh, is this some sort of left political agenda or Marxist agenda? Far from it. He talked about the history of the Industrial Revolution, in cycles, first of all in the UK and then in the US. And it was quite interesting. The one thing he said is that you need space to grow. And each of those two economies survived, UK first and then America, based on protectionism, i.e. they were given time to grow, they had tariffs and stuff, they were protected. And he was saying the problem is now with some of the more emergent economies around the world, which are struggling, is that people rationalize it and say, well, that's not working well because it's far too warm, right? They can't do it because it's just too hot in that part of the world, And he actually said, no, it's nothing to do with that, because you take the extremes. You've got Iceland, for instance, who's got an amazing economy doing extremely well and extremely cold. But the point is that we need a level of protectionism. So I think it's, again, if your example of the North, for instance, devolution, on one hand they need to have resources, but we also need people to give time and space to grow and set up for success, rather than just saying, sorry, you've had your chance, free market economy, you've had a year, it didn't work, and then let's go back to where we were.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's an interesting point. That these ideas need time to breathe, whereas certain fringe ideas, as I just touched upon, have had a long time to breathe, hence the shifting of the Overton window. But I think in terms of economics as well, I would definitely agree with your point that these new models that come in from the fringe do potentially need to be tried. So, for example, with Brexit, we're living through that now. We're living through its growth period, its breathing period, its operational period is now, and people are potentially not feeling very happy about it. Who knows where we're going to be in 2, 3, 4, 5 years time, 10 years time, beyond that. But there are other ideas that potentially could be explored if we are heading towards devolution, in terms of looking at things on a more local basis. I mean, capitalism is not all bad. Look how many people has lifted out of poverty. And although the original vision of Adam Smith has been kind of corroded in some ways over the years, because there was a strong moral sense in his original vision for what capitalism could do. It's been reduced down to the invisible hand, and that was only one small part of it. Ultimately, there was a very strong moral aspect, which was about taking care of those who were unable to take care of themselves. And I think that's the side of it I'd like to see us moving back towards, ultimately.
Yeah, the more benevolent side.
Absolutely.
So again, just thinking this. Do you think that we're going to be talking, Marcus, about the centre and the fringe in the future? Is this
absolutely.
Yeah, sorry.
So absolutely. I think it's I think there's, as you say, it's a pendulum that swings between both polarities, and certain things that end up in the centre will move out to the fringe. Things that are in the fringe will move to the centre, and wherever they are at any particular time will decide what the discourse is going to be around them. It's fascinating. So you see it happening on lots of different levels in culture. You've got certain figures out there, for example, like your Andrew Tates, who are taking potentially very fringe ideas about how we should treat each other as men and women, and bringing them into the centre by helping young people through technology and the internet take on these ideas. And now it's the work of society at large to potentially try and push these ideas back out to the fringe.
And what are some of just thinking about imbalance here? So there's obviously a pendulum, and that pendulum is never smack bang in the middle. It's never perfectly right. It's always oscillating, between these polarities. What are some of the consequences of imbalance by either focusing on just the centre or just the fringe? And you've talked about this in a really nuanced way. It depends on the context.
Sure.
So yeah, just some ideas about imbalance, really.
Okay, so looking at it through the creative lens, or if you're an artist or a creative and you actually want to make money from your fringe activity, if you remain on the fringes, and that might be as much as you never apply a business model to what you're doing, you're not necessarily going to be able to pay your bills from that activity. Whereas if you do find that sweet spot in the middle where you potentially find a business model for what it is you want to do, and can find a way to package it and find a long tail or a core audience for that, you could potentially make it pay for itself and potentially be profitable in doing that. Again, it depends on, as you said, it depends on the context. But I think sometimes focusing too much on the centre, particularly if we're talking about looking at it through a cultural lens, might mean the marvelisation of what it is that you're looking at, rather than potentially looking out to the fringe, or taking it a little bit out of the centre, where you can find your true audience, you can find those people who are going to appreciate what it is that you do, but might have more money in their pocket to spend on that. This is the type of thing you might see with theatre, for example, or opera, where you've got audiences who have money and can afford to go to the venues in central London to appreciate what are potentially quite fringe art forms or fringe productions.
And what about the context of innovation? So thinking about a business audience, because I do think of the fringe a bit like the edge that we talk about with innovation, that, you know, change happens at the edge, not at the center. But you know, ripping down the core of your business at the same time is trying to, you know, come up with new business models, new products, new services, is quite risky. So yeah, I don't, you know, every organization in every industry is going through profound change, and I'm sure you can speak to this as well, John, that actually, yeah, the kind of center, the structure, the organization, you know, is the support, the foundation for innovation. So getting that relationship right is tricky.
Yeah.
Well,
sorry, go ahead,
sorry, John. I was just going to say, I mean, I'd be interested to find out what you think about this, John, with the way that potentially models of hierarchies have had to change within organizations in order to attract new talent, you know.
Yeah, there's no doubt that, you know, flatter organizations, although that's kicking back a bit because there has to be some level of hierarchy and control. And as you know, there are certain regions around the world that are unbelievably hierarchical versus flat organization. You know, there's a famous psychologist, Geert Hofstede, who's got his 6 cultural dimensions, you know, and you've got the whole issue of power distance and masculinity and femininity and stuff. It's quite interesting. But going to your point, Ben, about innovation, right, and being on the fringe, you know, crypto and NFTs are a great example of that sort of innovation, something that's right on the fringe, which of course, again, is becoming more mainstream. But I'm just wondering whether there's a collaborative element, again, in a connection to get things together. And it reminds me of, there was a book written by, I think it was probably over the 80s and 90s, called Blue Ocean Strategy. And that was about, you know, taking one concept and then melding with another concept. The most, you know, famous one is Cirque du Soleil, you know, where they took a dying industry in terms of the circus. People had fallen out of love with it. It wasn't very innovative and stuff. And people were also bored with playing golf in terms of corporate entertainment. So they're bringing together the idea of the Vegas style circus, you know, and initially selling it to corporates and businesses, not to people first, and creating something new by bringing the two things together was extremely powerful, and creating the blue ocean away from the piranha pool. And I keep in my mind, I'm always thinking of connections, and I'm always thinking collaboration, if that makes sense, you know.
I think that's a really good point. It's really, really interesting what you touched upon there. The Cirque du Soleil example is perfect, because I think that's that for me is a key observation of where we're at in the 21st century. It's not that we're necessarily going to come up with anything new; it's the combinations of these things that are new. You know, so you're seeing combinations in culture, combinations of genres in films. You know, a Santa Claus action film, for example. You know, you're seeing the new combinations are coming up with things that have not been seen before, but the individual elements have been seen before, as you just said in the Cirque du Soleil example. And I think finding those things, which are a combination of both center and fringe, in that sweet spot that we're searching for, is a key skill, I think, that's required for the age that we live in. And I think any work or any tools that we can find or support or develop to help people with that, I think would be of value to many people, as it feels like certain ideas from the 20th century have kind of run out of steam, so to speak.
And yeah, and you mentioned something, since we're trying to think about ways forward and identifying sweet spots, and I think you both made a couple really good points. John, you mentioned something about the kind of analogy with a sine wave. So you mentioned to me before, but yeah, do you want to share that idea?
Yeah, I just think that it's a bit like the pendulum. I think life, you know, some of the cultural transformation work I've done in big organizations is we start off with the sine wave, because you have to kick a change in order to make a change. And usually that's quite radical in some form or other, because otherwise it's not going to happen. You know, things, you know, don't always happen. I mean, although change can happen in piecemeal, quite often there's not enough, unless you're radical enough, people don't recognize it's radical, you know. So you end up with this decreasing sine wave where, you know, you'll get one amplitude above the line, and then it will go kick back and go below the line, and then it'll come back up again, and you'll go through this, and eventually, you know, in one particular aerial concept, until you get another concept, of course, you'll get the decreasing sine wave. And it actually really reminds me of some coaching feedback I got back when I was working in Russia back in 2010, and a story in a book by one of the great global coaches, a guy called Marshall Goldsmith. And he talks about what got you here won't get you there. And it's all about dumping, for people who are familiar with the book, basically dumping certain habits and behaviors that are inappropriate when you move out of a sort of functional space into a sort of leadership space. And one of the things he says quite positively is that if you're going to make a change, you have to announce it. And that, especially if it's a personality or a behavioral change, not necessarily personality, more behavioral. If you don't announce it, you're not going to hold yourself accountable to it. And loads of people sometimes think, if they've had feedback, oh, well, I've made a change. And they may have made a change, but that change is relatively small, but known to them because nobody else will notice it. It has to be radical enough, maybe more, pushing yourself to your own personal boundaries and fringes, that it's noticeable by others. Because if it's not noticeable by others, it doesn't really count. It's a bit like the eye of the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That's what I was trying to say. And I think that's quite important in terms of making change. It has to be radical enough that something happens. It triggers something. Otherwise, quite often things just, and again, it's my own experience as well with the work I do, is things just don't get off the ground. People tend to pull back or acquiesce or whatever. I don't know whether that makes sense.
It's a really interesting point. I like the analogy of the center being your comfort zone, and the place where you're not so comfortable, where you've got to take on new modalities or new ways of working, as being the fringe. I think that's a really fascinating concept.
And any other thoughts on any concepts or analogies or tips for our viewers to think about actually, how do we find a sweet spot between the fringe and the center? Any other reflections?
Well, in terms of it, for those of you who are out there operating within the creative or cultural industries, trying to sort of derive a living from what you're doing, my advice would be to speak to the likes of John to see how you can potentially develop a business model around what you're doing. How can you wrap it up? How can you package it? How can you go on that journey towards creating a commodity out of what you're doing in a sense that's still honest to you, that still enables you to do what it is that you want to do. And going as far as with it as you're comfortable. I'll say that's a key thing. It's a key part of the work I'm involved in now, really. With supporting particularly organisations that in the past may have been grant funded, or they just survived year to year on grant funding from, say, local authorities or regional bodies or central government, and now those models no longer hold water. So it's about supporting these organizations into developing sustainable business models, which is taking them from the center that they're used to out to a fringe of potentially not being very comfortable and having to think about things in a totally different way.
So do you think there's some opportunities there, Marcus, for intergenerational collaboration? Because I know people talk about and it's a topic that we're not going to get into, is culture wars, but intergenerational stress and all that. But surely I think there's something like that where, and when you said the likes of the grant funding drying up and not being available, then there's an opportunity then for people who are experienced and have got some level of resource and accomplishment and history to actually start throwing some money back into the system. And it was interesting this morning, I listened to the radio LBC and had Julian Richer on from Richer Sounds. And even all the way through the pandemic, his music shops have stayed open. He owns most of his property, so he's not leasing, he's not beholden to other people. But he set up his own thing called a Fairness Foundation, and he's now become very, very philanthropic. He's had a very successful business for 40 years and the sort of retail hi-fi and music market and stuff. And now he wants to plow some stuff back. So I think there is a huge opportunity for people who have sort of, done what they need to do, and have got some level of personal satisfaction and accomplishment to actually help the youth,
I'm a big fan of any intergenerational work, because I think it seems to be something inherent in the West where we've lost that notion of our elders being able to pass on their wisdom, and in some cases, unfortunately, particularly here in the UK, beyond a certain age, people are removed from the conversation, so to speak, and I don't think that's fair, and I think it's something that definitely needs to be addressed. I think that lifetime knowledge, that tacit knowledge that somebody builds up through a long-standing career, successful or not, is useful to those who are coming up behind them, the younger generations. And I've worked and developed a number of intergenerational projects over the years to enable that passing of information, of developing of relationships because I think that's a key thing that we may have lost in the UK. Just having those long-standing relationships between communities and their elders, and I think it's something I'd personally like to see more of. You know, and I definitely think there's an opportunity then. I think as the resources that are available from governmental sources, for example, become less and less, we are going to have to rely on more on that knowledge that's around us, as I said, in our own local communities, and that includes elders as well. I think, you know.
I think just to round up on this is
phone one disconnected
and the conversation. I would say that both the older generation and the younger generation are increasingly both on the same fringe. Actually, there's lots of people. You mentioned disenfranchisement, John. That I think that growing old in our country and also being young in our country poses quite a lot of challenges. And I think there is an opportunity to meet on the fringe, and we seem to be focused on the centre on, average aged, working age, whatever you call it, and we've built the centre around that. But basically society functions with that transfer of knowledge between younger and older, and whether that's energy, wisdom, whichever way it's going. I think that there is an opportunity to see that both generations are increasing on the margins.
It's been great to see that. It's been great to see that through things like Extinction Rebellion, or Just Stop Oil. Whether or not you agree with what they're doing, you've seen young people and elders working together to achieve a goal, or to working together towards a shared vision, which I think has been great to see.
Yeah, no, great stuff. Well, I think it's a really powerful point to finish on. So thanks everyone for joining and tuning into Sweetspot Safari. I'm Ben. This has been John, and big thanks to you, Marcus.
Thank you, Marcus. Pleasure.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah. It's been an awesome conversation. I think this pattern and polarity will be popping up in quite a few people's vision going forward. So yeah, watch this space. By all means, follow us on YouTube at Sweetspot Safari, and look out for future episodes soon. Take care for now.
Thank you, everybody.